What does it mean when Britain sacrifices their spoiled, lecherous prince to save an institution, and America sacrifices an institution to save our spoiled, lecherous prince? Justice Neil Gorsuch basically saying in very polite Federalist Society language, the Constitution lodges the nation's lawmaking powers in Congress alone. I think that Supreme Court speak for, I'm going to have this job longer than the guy who hired me. Read the first. We have entered the Hallmark Channel version of fascist jurisprudence. So is this the new legal standard? If the trial didn't happen, the crime doesn't exist?
It is a violation of one's First Amendment rights to essentially threaten the use of federal agencies to come in and regulate without actually doing the regulation.
The New York Times has a great series that's starting about how we need to listen to the economic concerns of people who defecate on Nancy Pelosi's desk. I highly recommend it. Welcome to the Oath and the Office podcast. I am John Fugelsang. It's been quite a week. Judge Aileen Cannon is back in a sequel nobody asked for. The UK police have arrested Prince Andrew. What does it mean when Britain sacrifices their spoiled, lecherous prince to save an institution, and America sacrifices an institution to save our spoiled, lecherous prince? While their monarchy is acting more Republican than our republic, we need someone smarter, braver, and bolder than most mortal men, and that is Professor Corey Brettschneider, political science Ivy League professor and the author of The Oath and the Office, and the star and Mac Daddy of this podcast. Corey, it's so good to see you. Welcome.
Thanks, John. Your intros get better and more extreme every week, which I appreciate.
Just try to endanger your tenure, Professor. That's all I'm trying to do.
That's what we're doing here. And we'll talk about the tariffs case. You know, there's some good news on that front. Of course, we'll talk about Prince Andrew. And then I'm also happy to say in the second half, if you hang around, audience, we're going to get to a great discussion with Mike Pesca about the question of journalism and the question in particular about whether or not in a time in which democracy is under attack, the rules of journalism alter or whether they can stay the same. And it's a spirited discussion. I hope you'll hang out and listen to that too.
It really is. We don't see eye to eye on everything, and yet it's a really fun, funny conversation. But Professor, obviously, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, the 6-3 majority of the Supreme Court last week, including two of Trump's own appointees, decided barely that the rule of law now does apply to Donald Trump. The court ruled that he cannot use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, to impose his sweeping global tariff tantrums. Right-wing folks are mad. They're saying the court made a mess for Trump and the American people. I'm pretty sure it was Trump who made the mess. And of course, $175 billion in tariffs already collected. People are suing to get their money back. And all we know so far is Trump's response, Corey, which is to have no game, have an unhinged hissy fit, and attack the judges personally and talk about their families in kind of a creepy way. So let's begin with that. I mean, why is this decision so significant that they have struck down Trump's tariffs?
Well, let's just start with the awfulness that has been the Supreme Court during this assault on democracy. The court, in particular, using what's called the shadow docket. We've talked about this before, but for listeners, I want to remind them. This is a technique where the Supreme Court of the United States doesn't give reasons for its opinion. Part of what gives the court legitimacy in the first place is that it explains why it's doing what it's doing and what the law is. And yet in the shadow docket, they don't do that. They refuse to do it. And they have found overwhelmingly for Trump, again and again, undermining the lower courts that have often stopped him. And now, in the most significant case that we've seen, the Supreme Court has said, the most significant case in which they've stopped him, the Supreme Court has said very clearly, it's dictators that act by dictate or executive order, especially when the Constitution gives Congress the powers that are being usurped. And here in the tariffs case, it couldn't be clearer. I say this in my amicus brief with our colleagues, which prefigured a lot of what the decision said. The theme, no taxation without representation, it's taxation that was given to Congress. And a tariff is nothing but a tax. And yet here the president comes just claiming to usurp it. And more than that, I mean, the other real insult in these tariffs is that after Nixon, the Congress actually had a moment where it pushed back in a historical way against the president and the presidency. And it said, look, we're going to constrain the use of emergency power, including in economic emergencies. We're going to limit what you can do. And the real horror show of what Trump did is that he took this statute that limits his power and pretended in the most grotesque way that it gave them the power to unilaterally impose these tariffs. It does anything but. And guess what? The Supreme Court made both those points.
Yeah, I mean, I can't wait to see how the 175 billion in tariffs already collected gets returned to people, Corey. I mean, that's not crypto money. That is actual money paid by American importers, which means American businesses, which means American consumers, which means all of you. So it's, I mean, the obvious question is at first, who gets that back? Is there going to be a Venmo request? Do we all get store credit at Trump's merch site? Is there going to be a 15% processing fee to retrieve our illegal taxes? But one of the things that really stood out for me was the major questions doctrine, which I think is a thing that John Roberts just made up to knock down Joe Biden trying to fulfill a campaign promise to help out Americans with interest rates on student loan debts. The major questions doctrine was widely viewed as a tool used by the right-wing majority to limit administrative agencies, like the student loan case. Now they just used it to limit presidential power. Corey, what exactly is this thing that John Roberts made up for the rest of us?
I think, first of all, that is right. The origin story of major questions is largely about limiting the administrative state, limiting the rules that the Environmental Protection Agency can make, and other agencies that are trying to engage in taking Congress's law and implementing it as best they can. So now the question was, in a time in which the administrative agencies are increasingly the same as what the president says and does under the theory of the unitary executive, is this doctrine that before was used to constrain the agencies, including experts in those agencies, now going to be the tool that we can use to stop a president? And skeptics of the Supreme Court said, man, this is only about stopping administrative agencies. It's not going to be used by this court against Trump. And what we argued in the brief is that there is no difference under the unitary executive theory, good or bad. In the current world, the president and the administrative agencies are essentially the same. And so it has to constrain a president. That was our hope. Skeptics of our argument and of this court thought, no way are they going to do this. They're just purely partisan. And, some of us expected that we would get a majority of decent justices who came on the side of the law, and that's exactly what happened here. 6 justices said, by the way, what is obviously true, which is that a statute that stops a president can't be used to aggrandize his power. Of course, we had 3 dissenters, including the hackiest of the hacky, Justice
Who's
Kavanaugh.
That? Oh,
yes.
I'm
going to give that to Justice Kavanaugh.
I was like, that's a tough field between those 3, but go ahead.
It is a tough competition, but this is somebody who, in his opinion, just repeated what the administration said. And one of the subtle things about this opinion, one of the things I love that I haven't heard commentators comment on, is the Supreme Court called him out. 6 justices said, Justice Kavanaugh, all you're doing is repeating almost word for word what the administration said in their brief. And that's not judging. Judging means actually applying the law. And, thankfully, it hasn't always been the case. 6 justices here did apply the law.
Yeah, so what I didn't have on my bingo card was Justice Neil Gorsuch basically saying in very polite Federalist Society language, the Constitution lodges the nation's lawmaking powers in Congress alone, which is, I think that Supreme Court speak for, I'm going to have this job longer than the guy who hired me. Read the first article. I mean, Gorsuch even said that legislating is supposed to be slow and deliberative because that stability lets ordinary folks plan their lives when the rules shift from day to day. I mean, he was pretty much saying markets like predictability, not your damn mood swings, right? I mean, the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate tariffs. This liberal ruling is actually being constitutionally conservative.
I think, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh are often mentioned in the same breath, and Justice Gorsuch is worried about that being grouped in with a hack like Kavanaugh. And, he's proven himself in a couple of key moments to be much more of a serious justice. One example, actually, which really parallels this is when interpreting the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which protects against discrimination based on sex in employment in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Yeah. Justice Gorsuch said that includes gay and transgender people, plain as day. The word sex in the text obviously applies to discrimination against gay and transgender people, and that's the plain meaning of it. And what he said here is that the plain meaning, both of the law at issue, which is called IEPA, this International Emergencies Act, constrains the president. And what does the Constitution do? It gives, as you said, the taxation power, including the tariff-making power, to Congress. So, these aren't brilliant points. They are basic points that any judge should say, but he shows himself to be a person of integrity, especially in contrast to his co-clerk, who also clerked for Justice Kennedy, and that's Kavanaugh.
Right. By the way, within moments of the Supreme Court saying presidents can't do this, only Congress, Trump announces a new 10% global tariff, and then he upgrades it to 15%. Because I guess when the Supreme Court says you can't do that, the logical response is, oh yeah, watch me do something slightly different. So I guess we should expect more lawsuits, Corey, in the months and months to come. And they will be litigating this long after the Lord has had Donald Trump's arteries do what the Lord is going to have his arteries do.
A couple of points on that, if you don't mind, John.
Yeah, sure.
One is that absolutely his speech unhinged after the ruling, which attacked his justices for betraying him, essentially. I mean, this president has no idea of what the idea of an independent judiciary is supposed to be, and can't even imagine it. And, he's criticizing them for doing their jobs. I think that only is going to reinforce to them that we are facing an attack on democracy and that we need an independent judiciary. That's my hope. And it also is a message to the lower courts of the need to stand against this president who thinks that they all work for him. Is he defying the order? That's an interesting question. He certainly would want to, but the reporting seems to suggest that the lawyers internal to the executive branch are telling him, no, you can't just defy the Supreme Court. Now, they're trying to find other laws, including a trade act, that would authorize some of these tariffs. And now the question is, are they going to get away with it? But those laws, when you look at them, are much more constrained than this emergency statute. They have time limits on them, for instance. And so although they'll try to revive these tariffs, and although we're going to face litigation, I think the Supreme Court, these same 6 justices, are going to slam them down again. And that's a good thing for the country.
When we come back, Judge Aileen Cannon is back and Prince Andrew is going away. Don't go away. This is The Oath and the Office. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office. I'm John Fugelsang and Professor Brett Schneider, Judge Aileen Cannon. Like a sequel no one wanted, she has now blocked the release of Volume 2 of Special Counsel Jack Smith's report on the voluminous evidence of guilt in Donald Trump's classified documents case. And her reasoning was it would plainly offend her previous dismissal of the case and contravene basic notions of fairness. In other words, she's saying you can't know the crimes he committed because of basic notions of fairness. We have entered the Hallmark Channel version of fascist jurisprudence. Corey, I don't know where to begin. She said that we can't release the evidence because no adjudication of guilt has been reached, and that's because the case never reached a jury, but it never reached a jury because she dismissed it. So is this the new legal standard? If the trial didn't happen, the crime doesn't exist?
Wow, she really is a pale imitation of a judge, and she's not really engaged in judging. She's just engaged in trying to defend Donald Trump at all costs. We saw that during the documents case, and we talked about this at length, but she essentially said that Jack Smith's role as a special prosecutor, long established as part of the executive branch, was somehow unconstitutional and illegal. That was one thing she did to destroy the case. And now what she's doing is preventing the American people from seeing the evidence, seeing actually what Smith, as he's under attack, by the way, for illegally trying to shut down Donald Trump, to show the truth, which is that this president committed a crime and he was doing nothing more than looking into that wrongdoing. I think we've got to do some history here to see how wrong she is. The long history of investigations of presidents and former presidents involve special counsels like Jack Smith looking into wrongdoing and this is crucial, exposing the evidence to both Congress and the American people. And the idea is that a sitting president, certainly, who commits wrongdoing might be subject to impeachment, and the role, since Nixon, has been of the special prosecutor to reveal the truth, again, to the American people and to Congress. So let me just give you the examples. What happened during Watergate, and I talk about this in The Presidents and the People at length, is that the special prosecutors, Archibald Cox first, and then after he was fired and replaced by Leon Jaworski, compiled massive evidence of Nixon's crimes. And the decision was made to hand over in what was known as the roadmap to Congress and to the American people the details of what were happening. And that's what brought the Judiciary Committee during Nixon to vote up articles of impeachment and led to Nixon's resignation. During Clinton, the grand jury looking into Clinton's accused perjury and obstruction of justice, the information was passed on to the Congress, and impeachment, agree or not agree, we got to see what the report said. Mueller, even during the first Trump impeachment, looked into his wrongdoing, looked into his crimes, and exposed through his report this information. We should have had a fourth report, a report from Jack Smith, letting us know, letting us decide as Americans about whether or not impeachment is justified. Not just a precedent, but one that goes back decades. And here's this rando judge just saying, no, I'm going to shut it down.
That's it. I mean, again, she argued it would be unfair to release a report when there was no adjudication of guilt, but it's because she canceled the damn trial. And my favorite line from the whole thing, look at what you've done to me. I'm reading these rulings now. But she says, the court need not countenance this brazen stratagem. Brazen stratagem, Professor. That's like a boss fight in Dungeons and Dragons. The brazen stratagem. Historically, special counsel reports have always been released to the public, right? There is precedent here for this. We paid, our taxes paid for this information. And she's not saying the evidence isn't completely true.
Let me reiterate my examples. Nixon, Clinton, and Trump in the first administration. In none of those was there a conviction, and yet we had them released. And so the idea that she's just claiming this precedent that if there's no conviction, then we can't release, it wasn't like he was found not guilty after a trial. In all of those instances, in fact, this process of releasing the information to the Congress and to the American people was in lieu of a trial.
Yeah.
And so she's just making it up as she goes along. As she did make up this story about that the special prosecutor was somehow an illegal or unconstitutional appointment.
Well, here's my last question on this, and then we can move on to Prince Andrew, because that's what all the kids want to talk about. She's saying fairness to the defendant who hired the judge. Fairness because there was no jury verdict, because the defendant hired this judge. But fairness, Corey, in a constitutional system, I think, has to also include public accountability. If fairness is what's driving all this. Fairness includes transparency when extraordinary events occur. Fairness, I think, allows history to see the record. If a trial never happens due to judicial rulings, does the public lose access to the investigative findings by default? It seems like a future wiser court on the appellate level might overturn this.
Well, in order to get to that stage, Jack Smith would have to appeal it. And it's, there are questions about standing. We'd have to think more about how we would get that kind of appeal. And I'm not sure if it will happen. But the bottom line is, if it doesn't become transparent, if it doesn't become released, we've really undermined, there's so few, let me just put it in the most blunt way, there are so few checks on a president, so few checks on a criminal president. And as you know, I'm fond, maybe too much, of quoting Patrick Henry, who said, the system is not designed to handle a criminal president. There's nothing to stop such a force. That's the word he uses. And now one of the things that we do have, at least, to slow down a criminal president is transparency. And she's really seen our weakness in our constitutional system by denying us even the ability to see these things. Now, would impeachment come about if we saw what was released? Maybe. But even if it didn't, it would at least be a kind of accountability, and the kind of accountability that we got in the first Trump administration. And that, without these details, is really being denied to us. I mean, another thing that might happen is a subpoena by Congress in the instance, as I think about it, in the instance in which the Democratic Party takes the House. They might subpoena the report. That's going to be an interesting case, but I think they're, in pursuit of impeachment, they would have a right to see it. And the idea of grand jury secrecy in all of the examples that I gave was trumped by these interests in transparency.
I just think Aileen Cannon has bought a one-way ticket to Pam Bondi Island, where short-term power outweighs long-term disgrace. All right, I got to ask you about the UK, because they just went and arrested the arrestee formerly known as Prince. Prince Andrew has been. They pulled up to his house and they took him in, and his brother, the king, signed off on this because no one is above the law. Here, Corey, in America, we treat no one is above the law. That's more like a decorative throw pillow, like here, Pam Bondi's like, well, define above. But I just want to say, like in France, they have announced new investigations on Epstein-related human trafficking through his longtime associate Jean-Luc Brunel, who was found dead in his cell, but they're opening that up. In Brazil, they just sentenced their former president for his efforts to overthrow the government and illegally keep power. South Korea impeached a president and sentenced him to life in jail for insurrection this week. Britain arrested a prince, and in America, we re-elect the convicted felon and sex offender who had cops beaten for a lie. And we call that strength. And Trump signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act into law. They were supposed to release everything by December 19th. They've broken the law every day since. My question is, in the UK, they can do this. What institutional differences allowed that process to move forward there? Is it just that Pam Bondi's not in charge in the UK?
Well, I think that the systems that we have are often compared in a way that we teach in civics that turns out to be wrong. Let me give the civics 101 version of it. The civics version is America is a democracy and Britain is a monarchy. And in democracy, no one is above the law. We're all equal. In monarchy, the king is above the law. And here's the reality, and it goes back to the founding of the United States. We've always had two views about Britain. One, the view that you and I hold, and that many Americans, I think most Americans hold, which is exactly that no person is supposed to be above the law, not even a president. And we've had cases, including ones that connect to what I was talking about before, U.S. versus Nixon, 8-0, saying a president doesn't have immunity from a criminal subpoena, that they can be investigated, the same as everyone else. But there also is a very different understanding of America, and it's one that goes back to John Adams, who thought that the British king was too limited in his power, and that democracy had gotten too vast, and that we needed to increase the power of a president beyond the power of a British king. That might sound wild, but I document that in the Presidents and the People, and we've talked about it here. And with the immunity case, we've just doubled down on that authoritarian, monarchical idea of the Constitution. And so here's the result, and your analysis gets it perfectly, that in the rest of the world, where they have functioning democracies, you see indictments of a former prime minister,
right,
of a former prince. I love that line, by the way, John. I'm still laughing about it. The
arrestee formerly known as Prince. Thank you. I was up late on that one.
It's just too good. And I'm glad you admitted you didn't just come up with it, because that would be too brilliant. You had to have time for that one.
But you know what? One of the survivors, Marie-Jacques Chartouni, said if only DOJ acted as decisively. It took British police less than 3 weeks from the release of the latest tranche of Epstein files to arrest Andrew, making Pam Bondi and Kash Patel look increasingly inept. And she's right. This thing was never about one predator. It's about access and influence and money and this aristocratic ecosystem where power or proximity to power was the currency, and you're allowed to rape children.
Let me just double down on my point, right? Because I think partly it's the immunity story, and Trump's immunity is the opposite of the democratic idea that no person is above the law. But the other thing in our system that is a real weakness is that the Attorney General, and this is actually the origin story of the idea of the unitary executive, the founders actually debated, should the Attorney General be independently elected? In New York, for instance, Letitia James, the Attorney General, is independently elected and doesn't work for the governor, doesn't work for Hochul. And that has benefits of independence, that you can investigate, for instance, criminality within the executive branch. In our national system, the federal government, we don't have that situation. We have an Attorney General who works for the president, and that, good president, the president would say, hey, I don't want to have contact. You heard during Obama, the Attorney General was worried even about conversations on a tarmac with Obama.
Oh, yeah.
Now, contrast that to the abuse right now, which is, and you heard Preet Bharara talk about how he saw things that way. Don't even take the phone call. That was part of his thought process. But what this president has done is blown through those norms and shown the weakness of the system by essentially ordering the attorney general not to look into the crimes of the century, the vast crimes that are documented
Right?
in these files. And that's what we've got here.
Anyone who helped bring girls or women across state lines or to Epstein's private island could be charged with trafficking. Anyone who abused these underage children could still face charges of sexual assault or soliciting prostitution, which is what Epstein got nabbed for the last time. And this Department of Justice is investigating zero of the criminals cited in the files. They've named the victims and taken away their privacy, but they are protecting the guilty. They want you to believe, Corey, this was a child sex trafficking ring with no actual clients. We are witnessing a shift in democracies where some nations are enforcing elite accountability, and the United States is choosing not to. I don't think this story is going away before midterm time, Professor. Do you?
No, and I think it should go away as we defeat the Republican Party in Congress and this president. We're going to talk to Mike Pesca, who's a journalist and neutral. I'm not neutral. I'm not either. Threat to democracy, and I don't mind saying it. And we're not on FCC airwaves, so that we'll use our freedom. But I will say that's not enough. What we really need when it comes to this issue that we need to talk much more about, elite accountability, and that's really what you see in the Epstein files, is a grotesque and unaccountable elite.
Yeah.
We need to have legislation that ensures that this isn't going to continue to happen, and that holds the attorney general, that holds the president to account. One thing we need, and I've said this many times, is an independent prosecutor that can look into the wrongdoing by the executive branch without being fired by the person at the top, by the president.
I think Democrats who run on a special independent prosecutor just for Epstein files alone are the Democrats who are going to clean up in fundraising. And we shouldn't need a special prosecutor for this because we're supposed to have separation of powers. Good God, Professor, you beat this into me. You look at the tariffs, you look at the judicial defiance, you look at the blocked reports. We are in a separation of powers crisis right now because Mike Johnson is not the Speaker of the House. He appears to be Donald Trump's human diaper, holding in a lot of crap for this guy. Before we hit the break, really quick, Corey, what should Americans watch most closely in the next 6 months?
Well, I think the question of separation of powers, we've talked about that in relation to the Supreme Court, which is pushing back against Trump's illegal usurpation of Congress's power. Now the question is Congress also going to push back against the usurpation of its power, including its powers of investigation and oversight over agencies like ICE? And of course, the real thing to watch for as the midterms heat up is, are there candidates out there that are really taking a stand and saying, we're going to impeach this president? We pushed Senator Whitehouse, Representative Liu on that question. They didn't fully come on board with what we were saying, but they indicated to me that that is on the agenda. And I think we need to see an impeachment of this president at this point.
Oh, we need to see a lot of them. Come on, Democrats, start doing another article every week. Please. Fundraise off it. You know what I think? I think Democrats need to do what the Republicans did with their doomed suicidal repeal Obamacare votes. We laughed at them, but they were saying this is our messaging, and they fundraised off of it, and they were consistent. They were trying to take health care away from poor people because they're evil, but they were consistent in doing it, and it wasn't the folly that we thought it was. So I say start loading up. Just have different articles every week until something sticks. I know we have to hit a break. Mike Pesca is waiting in the wings. We'll be back in just a moment with The Oath and The Office. Welcome back to The Oath and The Office. I'm John Fugelsang. Professor Brettschneider, I am very excited about this guest. I am a longtime fan of his podcasting prowess, and we've also lived kind of parallel lives in the past, too. Tell the kids who's coming up.
It's a thrill to invite Mike Pesca, and there was, of course, a Long Island reunion between the two of you, both from Long Island. Mike Pesca is an award-winning journalist. He's the host of the longest-running daily news podcast, which, of course, is called The Gist. It was my honor to be on The Gist and to talk about the presidents and the people with him soon after it came out. And I'm also happy to announce that he's the brand-new host of the award-nominated podcast, How To. So, Mike Pesca, welcome to The Oath in the Office. It's a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me. I know that one of you is from Suffolk County and I'm from Nassau County, so we're going to have to get over that during this interview. That is a big barrier between the two counties of Long Island, but I'm sure by the end we'll be able to find common ground, maybe in Farmingdale.
And I hate to pull out my trump card, which is that I'm from Queens, Bayside. So.
Oh no!
It's another geographic Long Island.
Yeah. It does, right? That's right. Technically, it is Long Island. So, Mike, I mean, we've love to jump right in and ask you a question with your journalism hat on. One thing that we're talking a lot about on the Oath in the Office is the various ways that this administration is trying to shut down the opposition. And some of that, of course, is being done through criminal indictments of political opponents. But we're also focused on the way that this administration's used the FCC as a kind of weapon threatening opponents late night. So I would like to ask you just your thoughts about what's happening. And one of the themes we're also talking a lot about that I'd invite your thoughts on is how can journalists respond and fight back? How can comedians and those in entertainment?
Comedians, I think, maybe have the easiest assignment, right? Make the people laugh. And there are a lot of great comedy clubs and for that. Journalists, they kind of need, I mean, independent journalism is burgeoning these days, but I still think it's better to have actual newspapers, if nothing else, as launch pads for the future independent journalists of America. And we're seeing fewer and fewer of them. And then we saw huge cuts at the Washington Post, and that's pretty bad for democracy. Because if you look at, you'll often hear the counterpoint. Well, look at all these people who are doing journalists outside the mainstream, but how do you even hear about them in the first place? Exactly. Matt Taibbi was at Rolling Stone, or look at who's, top 10 in Substack. It's guys who are on CNN, or if it's Jennifer Rubin from the Washington Post. So without these both farm systems to teach people journalism, or these, like I said, launch pads, way to get people identified, it's not a system like the comedy clubs where you kind of rise up and then, maybe you get a sitcom, maybe you just do a podcast and sell out an arena. The whole journalism model is pretty broken. We could get to the FCC, but I was just wondering, since John is a foot in both worlds, does he have talked to a lot of comedians about this? I also have a show called Funny You Should Mention. It used to be that comedians were pretty sour on the ways to actually get noticed, and there was a big, the pipeline wasn't exactly open. But now I think journalists have a tougher time.
It's a good question, because when I was starting out, I was getting a lot of work doing dopey TV jobs that didn't really feel right for me. And I always wanted to talk about politics and religion as a comedian. And I'll always give Bill Maher credit. He was the first person to encourage me to go deeper into politics and religion and alienate potential employers in other realms. So, I mean, for a comedian, you have to recognize that when you take it on, yes, you can have that superpower of talking about what's going on. You can travel to other rooms where just comics who joke about normal stuff can't. But when you decide as a comedian to take on politics, you're signing on for having half the audience potentially hate you, for having most of your material be dated in 2 weeks, and for pretty much agreeing you don't ever want to be on late night TV shows, because the only people who ever do political comedy on TV, you might notice, are people who have their own TV shows. It's really tricky outside of like CNN panels to go on TV as a comic and talk about this stuff. But that's why you're right. I mean, I think you have 2 feet in the same world as well, because podcasting is allowing so many comedians to branch out and to be funny and yet talk about social issues at the same time. And I think you set a model for it, Mike, not that you're a stand-up, but that you always keep it entertaining first and preachy last, which is... Yeah. I think, what this is about. It's not just about delivering the information. It's also got to be highly listenable. And that's something I don't really think they teach at journalism school.
No, the ombudsman, which is it's not a gendered role. This is a Swedish word. But when they had ombudsman, they would always weigh in on, oh, that wasn't well sourced, or, oh, you could have given more information. They always default to give more information, your 45-second news slot to convey facts tersely. No, put 3 minutes worth of information there. But they never prioritize be interesting. And I always said you have to be informative, but you also have to be interesting. Now the algorithm just defines interesting in a way that I think is sort of more like a meth head would find things to be interesting. Right? And the old way of being interesting as a journalist is is maybe your lead graph is compelling, right? You don't start with statistics, but do people even have the opportunity to consider the lead graph or to consider a well-crafted written piece? I think not. But to Corey, go back to your question and Brendan Carr and the FCC. I think it's important to talk about the two big forays he had trying to influence the discourse and late night talk shows. So a few months ago, he jawboned stations to essentially intimidate them to take Jimmy Kimmel off the air. Jimmy Kimmel, critical of Trump and a disfavored host. And so he made the point, especially with these station groups that are considering a merger before the federal government, you might want, will anyone rid me of this meddlesome priest? You might not want to put that wisecracker on the air. And there's a lot of case law that I think you could talk about. It's very interesting. One might say, well, just talking out loud about things, is that allowed? And the Supreme Court has weighed in on jawboning as if you're a First Amendment advocate, as I am, it is a violation of one's First Amendment rights to essentially threaten the use of federal agencies to come in and regulate without actually doing the regulation. There's a case, it's very interesting because it was a New York case called, I think, Volo in New York, where she now teaches at Fordham Law School. She was a New York State administrator. She was jawboning to try to get certain companies to not do business with the NRA. And the jawboning itself was deemed the federal government impermissibly overstepping its bounds. And so that's what I think Carr was doing there. But now, when we come to the latest of what Carr was doing and try to maybe intimidate CBS from airing an interview with James Talrico, who's running for Senate, there's a question, which is, was Carr overstepping his bounds, or was he advocating for a more rigorous enforcement of what is within the FCC's ambit and purview?
For the first time.
That's right. That is true. But, if you have laws on the books and you decide to enforce them, that's allowed. If you decide to enforce them selectively, that's probably not allowed, and it shouldn't be allowed. And we should also note that he doesn't like what these late night comics are saying. So he wants to enforce the law, and he wants to enforce the equal time rule.
Right.
He, however, does not want to enforce that with AM talk radio, where, of course, everyone's a conservative. So we all know what's going on.
Greg Gutfeld's guest list is safe. You're so right. I mean, for so many years.
I got to say, and he actually filleted a senator from Nevada about this when she was like, why don't you weigh in on Fox? He is correct in saying, because they're not a broadcaster. I can only weigh in with the broadcasters. Sure. And that is antiquated and old, but that's the world we're living in. He sees himself as, I have a lever. I can shut up Colbert, or at least make his life hard, or at least convince the CBS lawyers that if he interviews Talrico, he also has to interview Jasmine Crockett. And that might not be an outrageous interpretation of what Carr was saying.
Well, I agree with everything, except we have to remember that the equal time rule is the most sacred of all rules to the FCC. Next to no nipples at the Super Bowl, that equal time rule is so sacred to the FCC that they never thought to bring it up until last week, because they don't want Talarico getting the Democratic nomination for Senate because they're terrified of all this Jesus talk. But you're right about Kimmel. The unsung hero there was Monday Night Football, threatening Sinclair. Okay, you don't need us either. And that's what made Sinclair back down. But what's amazing to me, and I ask both of you because your brains are much bigger than mine, at this point, how do we distinguish between legitimate oversight and intimidation? As corporate media is finally learning what stochastic terrorism is, we're learning this new stochastic self-censorship. I mean, regulatory pressure, even without a formal ban or policy, can create a really chilling effect. And Mike, I just wanted to ask, do you think soft censorship that we're seeing here with Colbert, with Kimmel, is this more dangerous than overt censorship precisely because it's so deniable?
I think that it's not, but it is dangerous. And I always come back to, isn't this subtle racism worse than when it's out in the open? And we used to say that when it was subtle, and then it got really out in the open. I'm
no,
it's not worse. It's not worse. One's a 10, one's a 7.5. Stochasticity, that is a really interesting frame to put on this. I do think it's actually more apt than the terrorism thing, because what it means is that it's just iterative, and little by little, drip by drip, you get the effect that you want. And there is a censorship, or there is a shutting down of speech that the FCC is engaged in. They have an interesting theory of the case, which is that Carr will say, I can't, well, he won't say I can't regulate, but he knows it's very hard for him to regulate the networks. And when people think of ABC, they think of Kimmel or Monday Night Football. And when they think of CBS, they think of Colbert. But the networks aren't licensed by the federal government. The broadcasters are. So he looks at the end users, and he knows that he could use that lever there. I do wonder, however, if his I used this phrase before, but I'll say it again. If his theory of the case was so detailed that he literally, or the Trump administration literally thinks that they want Talrico not to be the nominee, they'd rather have Jasmine Crockett, because maybe that's a sophisticated analysis of who is best to win that Texas race.
I don't think so.
But I can't see Trump weighing in to help Jasmine Crockett.
Exactly.
If he knew about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because they think the people of Texas would never go for her. They think that Talarico is so riskier because A, he's fluent in Jesus and they don't want to hear that at all. And B, they assume that Texas is so bigoted that a black woman in the Senate would be impossible. Whereas they're both great, and she could be the most transformative Texas politician since Ann Richards. Professor, go ahead. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, not at all. I was going to ask Mike to bring it back to your original point about journalism and sort of the way that it's falling apart. I mean, even if these things that Brendan Carr turns out to do are illegal, I mean, is there a worry, the way that you're looking at the landscape, that people are getting intimidated, that you're not seeing journalists stand up? I'm thinking of Barry Weiss and CBS and a lot of the traditional ways that journalists came up, rather than being CBS, for instance, being a bastion of independent journalism and fact checking. It looks like it's anything but. I mean, are they winning in that sense, even if what they're doing is illegal and ultimately they have to back down?
Well, I know you guys are open to debate and counter opinion, so I'm going to lay this on you. I wrote a piece called "Why Is No One Nice to Barry Weiss?" It rhymed, so I went with the headline. But my point was that it is true there are a couple of high-profile incidents that were alleged to have been some example of interceding to help Trump or to help the Trump agenda. However, I talked about those incidents. One was she got in there. She told CBS's 60 Minutes that a couple of hours, or not even 24 hours before air, that she had problems with a piece on Seacott Prison. And right. Sharon Alfonsi, who was the reporter on that piece, it didn't go public, but wrote a widely circulated memo that, as a sophisticated person in the news, she knew would go public, and she used the word censorship. I do not think it was censorship. I made the case that, but for the fact that it was so close to airtime, that it had the effect of not spiking the piece, and that's an important distinction, but holding the piece. Many of the edits were legitimate. And then the piece that did air a few weeks later was unchanged, the actual body of the piece, but there was a long addendum afterwards that I really thought, as a news consumer, gave worthy and excellent information. Like, there was a question about if tattoos would have warranted inclusion in a prison. And during the piece, they talked about this one guy's tattoos were the Jumpman logo from Michael Jordan, and he didn't have any tattoos that would, flag an investigator. However, the guy did have a swastika tattoo, and he had a 666 tattoo. And then 60 Minutes, I think they noted that
that's all you need, really. That's all you need to put somebody in a gulag.
No, it's wrong. You're right. There's absolutely no justification for that. But as an explanation, I would just say, if you want to strengthen and if you want to make a piece as airtight as possible, you even include the portions that don't open you up for critique on the back end. So I would say during the piece, they could have talked about the swastika as he did have this on him, however, and he doesn't even know what it is. And in many cultures, it doesn't have the valence that of Nazism. Okay, so there's a long way of saying that what Barry Weiss did, or what CBS did in that incident, was, I think, justifiable in terms of the substance of the piece. The timing was rather bad. Then there is the bigger question of, is she trying to turn CBS into some Trump water carrying network? And there are a couple of high profile examples, including Tony DeCopel, the new anchorman, saying, "We salute you, Marco Rubio." And you don't want an anchorman saying that. However, my sister was saying this to me, and I said, okay, how can I falsify that thesis, right? Because if a thesis is true, it has to be falsified. What other evidence might I be able to introduce such that you would say, it's not a water carrying network? What if I pointed to 100 or 200 incidents of their anchor people asking extremely tough questions to and of the Trump administration since Weiss took over? And that has happened. And they did one of the best interviews with Homan right after the ICE shooting. And Margaret Brennan has been great on Face the Nation, and other 60-minute pieces have absolutely filleted the Trump administration. So if you watch what people say about CBS, it's, I think, become a pile-on. If you actually watch CBS, and there's too much time to watch everything, I do think that it would be indistinguishable to most viewers if you put up the CBS Evening News and ABC World News Tonight and Tom Yamas's news. You wouldn't be able to say which one's the supposedly pro-Trump one. I do not believe.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to push back, one thought might be that all of the networks are to some degree not doing the kind of reporting that you would want to see when you have an assault on civil liberties, including what we started with. I mean, here's just a follow-up question about Weiss in particular. And one piece of reporting suggested that she failed to she was really criticizing the show for not interviewing Stephen Miller and giving him his full due. And I guess in that case, it was a normal official. I might see the point, but Stephen Miller, of course, is known for lying, for just, acting in a way that words don't seem to connect to truth necessarily. And I guess I wonder about that. Also, the other worry was, the sort of affection that she showed for Trump in person at one point. And so, I mean, do any of those concern you? And also more broadly, I mean, what about the thought that, yes, they might not be that different than the other network players, but maybe we're in trouble, and that corporate media more generally just isn't, and it's not, I don't think, disconnected from our other discussion, because there is a chilling effect going on when you see Trump threatening his critics as he has across the board.
Yeah, I have no problem with a purveyor of news trying to establish decent relationships with newsmakers. This happens all the time. It happened when there was this kerfuffle when the host of Morning Joe went down to Mar-a-Lago. And I think a lot of people talked about bending the knee. And I don't know what actually happened there, but this is just a tried and true tactic of, you talk to the people you're going to be reporting on and say
they've
something
been very
like,
critical. You're right. And Bill Maher, too.
Oh, yeah. People filleted Bill Maher for taking that meeting. And, Bill Maher has a quasi news show. It's what you do with the actual coverage, not the optics of if you're nice or not, or seemingly nice, or kiss someone on the cheek.
Agree.
Then again, many of us might say, I think my lips might melt off if I tried to kiss him. But,
if I had to do
then
that.
again, don't take the job of running a news organization, because that's what a news organization has to do. And to convince the people that you're reporting on that you're going to be fair, I think is fine. Now, as far as getting a reference or a quote from Stephen Miller, if you can't do that, the piece would probably be better if you get one of his classic spittle-flecked invectives. I don't know that it helps, but I think she also tried to get Homan, and she has, or that organization has shown that it has a decent in with Homan, because he was on the evening news right after the killing, the second killing in Minnesota. So I'm saying it's worth a try. It probably wasn't worth a try at that last moment, but Sharon Alfonsi said, if we allow the administration to have the last say in this, and they could spike a piece, then we're not engaging in journalism. That is true, but that's not what happened.
But the piece had been, the 60-minute piece had been legally vetted and finalized for broadcast.
Yeah, but legal vetting isn't the same. Right. Legal. I mean, I've had many pieces. You probably have the equivalent of, yes, this passes muster, we won't get sued. It doesn't mean that, it's the best piece it can be.
Right, but I think Sharon Alfonsi's whole critique was that this was political. This wasn't editorial. This was because it was yielding to political pressure because Trump was publicly complaining about 60 Minutes, and now Anderson Cooper apparently has more free time on his hands to be a dad. I mean, the
Yeah.
dots, seem to scream to be connected.
Right. They seem to be. I'm not saying you're wrong, and there's certainly there's something going on politically in that Paramount and Skydance do seek approval
Oh
of
yes.
a merger if that happens. If I was Alfonsi, I'd be unbelievably upset. She did the piece in the way that 60 Minutes, which is the most highly regarded broadcast news program out there. They have like a murder room of, a murder board, which is a phrase where people ask you the toughest questions, and the piece is past that. And the regular process of a 60 Minutes piece, which is like the gold standard, had been passed. So she doesn't want to have to fly back from Texas and redo a piece. And she got upset, and it's understandable. And she made allegations like censorship, and she said that it seems political. I can understand her being upset about that. I don't think the process was great, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was political. There are many other explanations for what it could have been. Then again, I can't disprove that there wasn't some political motivation, and it could be broader. Like, here's the politics of it. We're redefining CBS as something different from what it had been. And everyone at CBS will say something like, well, that's horrible, because what CBS had been is, and they'll reach for Murrow and Harvest of Shame and the greatest thing CBS has done. But if you look at the ratings, what CBS is a last place network. And if you don't, and kind of by a lot in a lot of its news. And I'll also add that 60 Minutes is still a highly rated news show after football. And when it doesn't air after an NFL game with its lead-in, it's a mediocre news show. It doesn't even do as well as 48. Not mediocre in quality, but if it's watched. And so these broadcast networks want viewers, and they want money, and they want to maybe take a few more Hail Marys than the people within CBS who think that they're the guardians of this great institution that cannot fail.
Can I, Mike, just pull back a little bit to the big picture and ask, and this is a really interesting discussion. You're giving a defense of journalism as it's traditionally practiced, and in a normal time, I would say absolutely. But I guess I think what makes this moment different is that the president of the United States is in an all-out attack on free speech and on our institutions of democracy. And so my question to you, thinking about all these journalistic principles, is whether or not the sort of traditional balance and neutrality that we might associate with journalism has to shift a little bit. Maybe you think it doesn't, but even we had Jake Tapper a few weeks ago, and I was surprised that by the end of the discussion, he really just came out and said, yes, it's not a two sides moment, even for me, even for traditional journalism, because when you have an attack on democracy, you have to cover it as such. So I guess that's I don't know if it's a pushback as we abstract from the Barry Weiss case and pull back from that specific example. But I mean, what do you think? That my sense is that it really isn't a moment in which we hear equally from two sides, or we consider Stephen Miller's view alongside its opposite, that we have to do a kind of coverage of the moment that understands the historical place that we're in, which is that democracy is fragile, and that all the institutions that we've for a very long time taken for granted are under attack. As you said quite rightly, there was a lot of talk in previous decades about subtle forms of racism, and now white supremacy is so overt. We're facing a different kind of threat, different magnitude, and I guess I think that too about the president. So just invite you to react to that.
Yeah, I most identify with Marty Baron, who was then editing the Washington Post. And there was this discussion in the newsroom right after Trump was elected the first time. And what Baron said was, we don't go to war, we go to work. That's what I think you should do. You shouldn't issue fairness. You shouldn't issue. I am still a believer in the ideal of objectivity, not that it could always or maybe even ever be achieved, but this notion in journalism circles of there's no such thing as objectivity. So let's just predefine the truth and report from there. I do not think that that is the best way to actually arrive at the truth. So yeah, Jake's absolutely right. There's no two sides to, hey, maybe the January 6th rioters had some really good points, or were some really good people, or shit on Nancy Pelosi's desk in a really good way for their ballots, right? There's no way to do that. And there are so many stories like that. But when you can, and I don't think the CCOP prison is, some example that we have to orient ourselves around, you should consider the accurate sides of an issue, not come predetermined. There are some things, there are some points that even the Trump administration makes correctly. And then I think your discernment, or a journalist's discernment, doesn't even necessarily come from, let's give Trump his due, or the Trump faction their full due. It's more like, of the people correctly who are upset or up in arms about what Trump is doing, what is the best and most rational tone or analysis, right? So I'm just thinking of this recent Supreme Court case. And beforehand, there was a lot of analysis saying the Supreme Court is illegitimate and we're in a constitutional crisis. So you can report on it like that. You could report on it as if that's your assumption. Or you can say, well, what's a constitutional crisis? Let's define what that is. What are the costs of calling the Supreme Court illegitimate? If the Supreme Court then comes and strikes down something like the tariffs, if we already define them as illegitimate, doesn't that give Trump a lot of room and leeway to act as if that ruling was illegitimate? So I think that is where it's not both sides, but it's a full analysis and a fair analysis of different ways of interpreting all the phenomena that's going on in our society.
I just want to say the New York Times has a great series that's starting about how we need to listen to the economic concerns of people who defecate on Nancy Pelosi's desk. I highly recommend it. Mike, you've been so generous
with Midwestern diners, and they've defecated.
We've found so many men who defecated in the Capitol that day, and we're listening to them. You're so generous with your time.
We can only put it in little boxes and ship it into that company where we could find out if they have bowel disease.
I wanted to just ask you one last question, if I can drag you here for a little longer. Your new show, How To, your work is really known for engaging people you disagree with to an admirable extent. And I'm just curious, on a how-to level, what have you learned about arguing without dehumanizing?
Well, one of the last hosts of that show is Amanda Ripley, and she wrote the best book on this, about how we spin out into conflict that we can't pull back from. And so what I try to do, what I said to you, is something like, if I were to falsify that, and as people who believe in the Enlightenment and the ability to falsify a thesis, that struck you as, oh, yes, for something to be true, that is it something we have to engage with. And then I said something like, might I present to you some counter ideas? And then, this probably tickled your self-conception of men who are open-minded. So that was, I don't know if it's a tactic. I fell into it quite logically, but that's the sort of thing that I try to do when disagreeing, and coming out with a blunderbuss of counter statistics. It does get the most engagement in our algorithmic world, and all these headlines like Fugel saying owns Pesca. That'll do better.
Well, that's the title of our show. How did you know?
Oh, please spell it with a P, Corey. Please spell owned with a P so I can pander to millennials, please.
Oh, my God. You really guessed it.
The poning of Pesca.
Oh, my God.
That'll play better.
Down.
But
I find my friends who like the Confederacy really like the concept of owning people. Wow. Mike, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Mike. What a pleasure to have you on the Oath in the Office.
Mike, what is the best way for our evil army to follow you and to keep up with your brilliance all the time?
My show is The Gist. It's on every day. And then I have the show How To. So the recent one is How to Emigrate to the Netherlands as a Thruple, because Dan Savage has that question. He's actually more than a thruple. It's polyamorous. So you can check out those two shows wherever you get your podcasts, or go to MikePesca.com.
Right on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mike.
Much gratitude to Mike Pesca. Corey, great booking. Thank you so much. You get the best guess. And Professor, what's the best way for our listeners to keep up with your brilliance the other 6 days of the week?
Well, you can find me on Blue Sky as Democracy Prof. Of course, you can review us wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple. We're way beyond 530 now, and almost all 5 stars. So thanks for that. And, tell your friends, send an email, let them know. What a great discussion we had today, including the great discussion about journalism with Mike Pesca, following up on other discussions. And of course, good to have people that we don't always agree with.
Right on. Well, thank you, Professor. You guys can hear me on Sirius XM 5 nights a week on Channel 127. Corey joins me live every Monday, and we do take your calls. And I got a Substack. My book is Separation of Church and Hate. And Professor, thank you so much once again for another great episode. We'll see you guys next time on The Oath and the Office.